The morning Fannie Vaughn rode into Harlan Creek, Wyoming territory. The sky looked like it was trying to swallow the sun whole, and she figured that was about as good an omen as any for what she was about to do. September of 1882 had arrived with a cold edge that bit clean through a person's coat and settled into their bones, and Fannie had spent the last 4 days on a stagecoach from Cheyenne, watching the landscape grow wilder and more unforgiving with every mile. She was 24 years old, recently widowed of a man she had not loved nearly enough to grieve properly, and carrying nothing but a trunk, a reputation for stubbornness, and a letter from one Albert Garrison of Harlan Creek that had offered her a peculiar arrangement. She read the letter again on the final stretch, the paper worn soft from handling. "Miss Vaughn, I have heard from my cousin in Cheyenne that you are a woman of practical mind and steady constitution. I am a rancher of some means, unattached and facing a situation that requires a wife for the winter season. The arrangements are these. You would live in my home, keep house, and be treated with full respect and dignity. Come spring thaw, if neither party wishes to continue, we dissolve the arrangement peaceably, and I will fund your passage wherever you choose to go. I am not a man of poetry, but I am an honest one. If this suits you, come on the 1st of October. Albert Garrison." Fannie had written back one sentence. "I will be there by the 30th of September to look the situation over first." She had not waited for his response. The stagecoach rolled into Harlan Creek just past noon, and Fannie stepped down onto the main street of the smallest town she had ever seen in her life. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that looked like it was losing a slow war with the wind, a church with a leaning steeple, and exactly 4 other buildings that might charitably be called businesses. A woman in a calico apron was sweeping her porch across the way and stopped to stare without any pretense of subtlety. 2 old men sat outside the saloon with their boots crossed and their hats pulled low, watching Fannie with the same unhurried attention they might give a weather vane. She smoothed her travel-worn skirt, squared her shoulders, and said to the stagecoach driver, "Is there someone named Albert Garrison in this town, or have I made a terrible mistake?" The driver, a leathery man named Odell, laughed around his tobacco. "Albert Garrison, sure enough. He'll be the one riding in from the north end right about now, I'd wager. Man has a sense for things." Fannie turned and saw him. He was coming down the main street on a dark bay horse, moving at an easy walk, and even from a distance she could see he was a man who occupied space without apology. He wore a dusty brown hat pulled against the wind, a canvas work coat, and the expression of a man who had learned not to expect much and was therefore perpetually surprised by things going reasonably well. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean and broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual labor rather than show, with a jaw that needed a razor's attention and dark eyes that, as he drew closer, she found were trained entirely on her. He pulled up the horse and looked at her from the saddle for a moment that went a breath longer than was polite. Then he climbed down, removed his hat, and said, "Miss Vaughn, you came early. I said I would. You said you'd look the situation over first." "I am looking," Fannie said. "Give me a moment." He stood there and let her look, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Most men, in her experience, filled silence with noise when a woman was thinking. Albert Garrison just stood in the street with his hat in his hands and let her complete her assessment. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, but there was a steadiness to his face that she found more interesting than handsomeness. His hands were rough and capable. His boots were clean despite the obvious hard use they'd seen. He met her eyes without wavering, and he did not smile in the practiced way that men sometimes smiled at women they were trying to maneuver. "All right," Fannie said. "Show me the house." "I've got your trunk," he said, and before she could protest he had lifted it from the back of the stagecoach with the ease of a man who was accustomed to moving heavy things, and secured it behind his saddle. They walked the short distance from town to his property, him leading the horse, her walking alongside. The land opened up as they left the main street behind, rolling grassland interrupted by stands of cottonwood gone gold at the edges, the mountains in the north already wearing their first snow like a crown they couldn't quite take seriously. "You raise cattle?" she asked. "Cattle and some horses. I've got 3 men who help through the driving season. They'll head south for the winter, that's partly the situation. The house gets lonely. The house gets cold," he said, "and the work doesn't stop because a man is alone. There's the animals and the preserving and the firewood and about 40 other things that go better with 2 people. So it's a practical arrangement," she said. "That's what I put in the letter." "And you said practical," Fannie said. "You didn't say easy or simple, I noticed that." He glanced at her sidelong. "No. I didn't say either of those." The house came into view around a bend in the trail, and Fannie stopped walking. It was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for a sod shanty or something barely better, the kind of dwelling that frontier bachelors threw up in a season and never improved upon. But Albert Garrison's house was a proper structure, timber-framed and solid, with a covered porch running across the front, real glass windows that caught the afternoon light, and a well-kept yard with a kitchen garden that was putting itself to bed for winter. There was a barn behind it, large and well-built, and a smaller outbuilding she couldn't identify yet. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Mostly. Neighbors helped with the heavy framing. It's 4 rooms. Bedroom, kitchen, sitting room, and a room I've been using as a storeroom, but you'd have it for yourself." Fannie looked at him. "My own room. I said I would treat you with respect and dignity. That was not decoration." She turned back to the house and took a slow breath. The mountains were cold and enormous behind it, and the golden light of late September was pouring over everything like something being poured for the last time before winter sealed it all away. A cat of remarkable orange color was sitting on the porch railing watching them with the detached superiority that cats maintained in all eras. "What's the cat's name?" she asked. "I call him General," Albert said. "Does he earn the rank?" "He runs the place as he sees fit, and I've learned not to argue with him." Fannie almost smiled. She caught it just in time and replaced it with something more measured. "All right, Mr. Garrison. I'll look at the inside." The inside was clean, which impressed her more than anything. A man living alone in a frontier house in Wyoming territory in 1882 did not have to keep a clean house, and the fact that this one did told her something. The kitchen had a proper iron stove, a dry sink, and shelves lined with preserves and dry goods. The sitting room had 2 chairs and a small table and a shelf of books that she looked at immediately, because books told you a great deal about a person. There was a Bible, naturally. There was a copy of Walden that looked like it had been read more than once. There was a history of the Wyoming territory, a farming almanac from 1880, a novel by Charles Dickens, and, unexpectedly, a slim volume of poetry by Walt Whitman. She pulled out the Whitman and looked at it, then looked at him. "You said you were not a man of poetry," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite embarrassment, more like being caught out at something he had kept private. "I said I was not a man of poetry in my letter writing," he said. "I didn't say anything about my reading." Fannie set the book back carefully and turned to face him. "Mr. Garrison, I will accept your arrangement, winter to spring, as you proposed. I will keep the house and help with whatever needs doing. You will treat me with respect. Come spring, we reassess." He nodded slowly. "Those are my terms exactly. Then we have an agreement." He put out his hand and she shook it, and for just a moment, standing in his sitting room with the pale Wyoming light coming through real glass windows, Fannie Vaughn felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not hope exactly. Something quieter than hope. Something that felt more like the first breath of relief after holding your breath too long. She was not going to name it. Not yet. Probably not ever. They married 3 days later at the Leaning Church in Harlan Creek, in front of Reverend Horace Pratt and a gathering of perhaps 12 curious townspeople who had come less for celebration and more for the spectacle of Albert Garrison finally acquiring a wife. The ceremony was brief and practical, which suited them both. Fannie wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had made herself 2 years ago and still fit well, and Albert wore a clean shirt and his least-worn boots, and had clearly made an attempt at his jaw with a razor that had gone better than she expected. When Reverend Pratt said, "You may kiss your bride," there was a moment of mutual hesitation that was observed with great interest by the assembled 12. Then Albert turned to her, and there was a question in his eyes that she answered by tilting her chin up slightly, and he touched her cheek with one rough hand and pressed a brief, careful kiss to her lips, and someone in the pew behind them let out a small sigh of romantic satisfaction. Fanny's heart did something she was going to blame entirely on the cold walk to church. The woman in the calico apron, whose name turned out to be Ruth Heller, came to shake Fanny's hand afterward with the directness of someone who had appointed herself the social center of Harlan Creek. "Well," Ruth said, squeezing Fanny's hand hard enough to communicate real feeling, "it's about time someone moved into that house and put some warmth in it. Albert Garrison has been rattling around in there like a marble in a box. You seem like a sensible woman." "I hope to be," Fanny said. "He's a good man," Ruth said, lower now, with the particular emphasis of a woman delivering information she considered vital. "Strange sometimes, and closed up the way men out here get, but good all the way through. You'll find that." Fanny did not say that she was only there for the winter and wasn't planning on finding very much at all. It seemed unkind, and besides, she was beginning to suspect that Ruth Heller was the kind of woman who would argue with her about it. The first week was careful and a little stiff, the way that two people who are essentially strangers inhabiting the same small house will be careful and stiff. They had their meals together, which Fanny cooked and Albert cleaned up after without being asked, a division of labor that emerged naturally and without negotiation. He was up before her most mornings, already out with the animals by the time she had the stove going, and he came in mid-morning for coffee and ate whatever she'd made without complaint or excessive praise, which she appreciated. Excessive praise in a man, in her experience, was usually a precursor to excessive demands. He had given her the storeroom as promised, and she had arranged it to suit herself with quiet efficiency. Her trunk against one wall, her few personal items on the windowsill, a hook behind the door for her coat and nightgown. It was smaller than any room she had lived in as an adult, but it was hers, and the window faced east, which meant she got the morning light. In those first days, she learned that he was methodical where she was efficient, that he went quiet when he was thinking in a way that she had initially mistaken for disapproval, that he had strong opinions about the right way to stack firewood and moderate opinions about almost everything else, and that he was, in fact, as honest as he had claimed to be in his letter. She learned this last thing on the fourth day, when she inadvertently overheard him talking to the orange cat in the barn. She had gone out to bring him an early lunch because the temperature had dropped sharply and she thought he might not stop otherwise, and she heard his voice before she reached the barn door, that low, even voice saying, "She's not what I expected, General. I don't know what she is. She's like walking into a room that someone's arranged differently than you thought, and suddenly you can't remember how it was before." There was a silence that presumably represented the cat's response. "I know," Albert said. "It's only been 4 days, and it's a temporary arrangement. She made that clear enough. I'm not building anything on sand." Fanny stood outside the barn door for a moment, not because she wanted to eavesdrop further, but because she needed a moment to compose her face back into its normal expression. Then she knocked on the barn post and called, "I've brought food," and heard the slight pause before he answered that told her he had not realized she was there, and she was grateful for that. October arrived with serious intent. The first hard frost came on the 3rd of October and settled a white silence over the landscape that Fanny found both beautiful and sobering. She understood now, viscerally, why a man alone on a remote ranch needed practical help in winter. The work was constant and physical. The animals needed more care in cold. The house needed more fuel. The water situation required attention to keep pipes from freezing. The food stores needed proper management to last through the months when resupply was limited. She fell into the rhythms of it. She was not a fragile woman. Her first husband, Thomas Vaughn, had run a small farm in Kansas before a fever took him the previous February, and she had worked that land alongside him for 3 years. She knew how to work. What she had not known was that working alongside a person who matched your rhythm could feel so different from working alongside one who didn't. Albert Garrison matched her rhythm without trying. He noticed, on the 5th morning, that she reorganized the kitchen shelves for efficiency, and he did not comment on it except to observe the next time he needed something that it was in a logical place. He noticed, a week in, that she had been making bread every other day because there was no established schedule, and he told her then that the previous pattern had been whenever he got around to it, which she had already gathered, and they agreed on a schedule without any particular fanfare. Small things. But small things had a way of accumulating into something larger, she was finding, whether you intended them to or not. The evening of the 8th of October, she came into the sitting room after washing up from supper and found Albert standing outside through the front window, which he had left slightly open to let in the cold air. He was on the porch, and she could see the glow of the lamp through the glass picking out the angles of his face, and he was doing something with his hands that took her a moment to identify. He was measuring. He had a length of cord stretched along the porch, and he was walking it out and knotting it at intervals, looking at the space with the particular focused attention of a man who was calculating something seriously. She watched him for a moment, puzzled, then pulled on her shawl and went out. "What are you measuring?" she asked. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that she couldn't quite read in the lamplight. He seemed to be deciding something. "I'm thinking about building on," he said. "Building on to the house. Another room." He said it simply, without embellishment, and looked back at the cord in his hands. Fannie stood in the cold for a moment, looking at the side of the house he was measuring against, trying to work out the geography of it. Where would it go? Off the east side. There's room there without interfering with the drainage from the barn. Take the corner space that's wasted now. He paused. It would be a proper room, larger than the storeroom. She looked at him steadily in the lamplight. "You're building a room in October." "Starting in October," he said. "The framing needs to happen before the ground freezes hard. I can do the interior work through the winter." "Albert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his Christian name, and they both registered it, though neither acknowledged it aloud. "We agreed on a temporary arrangement." He met her eyes. "I know what we agreed. I'm just building a room. A room needs a reason." "House can always use another room," he said, quiet and steady, and the cold came off him in visible breath, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been discovering over these 8 days were not unreadable at all. They were just slow to open, and when they did, there was something behind them that she found more unsettling than she had any reason to find it. She went back inside without answering him, which was not the same as telling him to stop. He started building on the 10th of October. She heard him every morning after breakfast, the regular clean sound of a hammer meeting wood, and when she looked out the east window, she could see the framing going up piece by piece with the methodical patience that characterized everything Albert Garrison did. He was building something that would last. That much was clear from the way he worked, the way he chose his timber and checked his lines, and went back to redo anything that did not meet his standard. She did not ask him about it again. But she brought coffee out to where he worked at mid-morning, and he took it with cold hands that he wrapped around the cup, and a look of gratitude that he expressed by not spilling any of it. "The joints are good," she said, looking at the framing. "My father was a carpenter." He looked up from the cup. "In Cheyenne, before that, Missouri. He built houses for other people all his life and died in a house with a leaking roof." She said it without bitterness, just as fact. He was better at building for other people than himself. "That's a common affliction," Albert said. Fannie looked at him. "Is it yours?" He thought about this with the seriousness he brought to most questions. "Maybe. I built this house knowing I was building it alone. I built it big enough for company that didn't come." She looked at the framing of the new room and then looked at him, and there was a long moment in the cold October morning where the hammer was silent, and the mountains stood in their permanent snow, and the orange cat walked importantly across the yard between them. "I'm going to put a medicinal garden in the spring," Fannie said. It was an entirely non sequitur thing to say, and she said it because she was standing at a precipice and needed to back up, and saying something about a spring garden was the furthest from a precipice she could get in that moment. He looked at her. He understood something from her tone, or maybe from her eyes, that she had not said in words. "Good place for one just south of the kitchen window," he said. "Plenty of sun." She nodded and went back inside, and he picked up his hammer again, and the sound of it followed her through the kitchen all morning like a conversation in a language she was learning. The first real snowfall came on the 17th of October, and it came in earnest. Fannie woke to white silence and looked out her east-facing window at a world that had been remade overnight, the mountains invisible behind low clouds, the yard a blank page, and the skeleton of the new room's framing standing in it, wearing a cap of white. Albert had gotten the frame fully erected by the 16th. She had watched it happen day by day, timber by timber, the shape of the room becoming real against the side of the house like something that had been there waiting to be built. He was planning to work on the walls and roof from the inside when the weather made outdoor work impossible, he had told her, and she had nodded as if this were any ordinary information. There was something she could not avoid, standing at that window in the early morning white. The room was being built for her. He had not said so. He would probably not say so, being a man who did not say things until they were entirely necessary. But the storeroom was small and impractical for a permanent occupant, and the new room was going to be large and east-facing, and built with the same serious care that this man brought to everything he cared about. She was not supposed to be a permanent occupant. She told herself this firmly and then went to start the stove, moving through the quiet house with the efficiency she had established, finding coffee and the bread from yesterday, and the pattern of the morning that had in 6 weeks become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. He came in from the morning chores with snow on his hat and shoulders and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, the way he always did. She had learned he always paused in doorways for a moment, as if checking that the room he was entering was the same one he expected, and then hung his hat on its hook and took the chair at the table that had become, without discussion, his chair. "Snow's deep on the east side," he said. "I put boards across from the house to the barn today. It'll get deeper. I was going to do the butter today. I'll lay the boards first, shouldn't take long." He said, "I'll not you could, and shouldn't take long not I'll try." Fannie found herself paying attention to these things. The small precision of how he spoke, the absence of false modesty or inflated promise. He said what he meant, and did what he said with a consistency that she was finding, quietly and without her permission, to be one of the most deeply attractive qualities she had encountered in a person. She was going to need to stop noticing things about him. Ruth Heller came calling on the 21st of October with a jar of apple preserves and the specific energy of a woman with news she could hardly contain. "Fletcher Dune's men were spotted near the East Ridge," Ruth said, sitting down at Fannie's kitchen table and accepting coffee with both hands. Ruth was 42, broad-shouldered and warm-hearted, with gray threading through brown hair and the constitution of a woman who had survived a great deal and refused to be diminished by it. "That's the 3rd time in 2 months. Sheriff Dunmore says he can't prove anything yet, but everyone knows those men have been moving cattle that don't belong to them." Fannie set down her own cup. "Albert's cattle. 3 head went missing from the Garrison range last month. He didn't mention it. He mentioned he'd had some losses. He didn't specify how." Ruth looked at her steadily. "He wouldn't. Albert Garrison keeps his troubles to himself as a matter of principle. It's the one thing about him that makes a body want to shake him." She paused. "He tell you about building the room?" "I can hear him building it," Fannie said carefully. Ruth's expression said everything her words chose not to. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at Fannie with the forthright affection of a woman who had appointed herself a guardian of local sanity. "He hasn't built anything new on that property in 3 years. He built the barn in 79, the house in 80, and then he stopped, said it was enough. She paused. Men out here don't start building in October, Fannie, not without a good reason. The room was needed, Fannie said, keeping her voice level. Was it? The storeroom is too small for Fannie, Ruth said with great gentleness. Fannie looked at her hands around her cup. It was supposed to be a winter arrangement. I know what it was supposed to be, Ruth said. I also know that man has ridden into town twice in the last 2 weeks for things he could have waited on. And one of those times he came back with a tin of cinnamon and a hair comb that no bachelor in the history of this territory has ever purchased for himself. Fannie thought of the cinnamon that had appeared on the kitchen shelf 3 days ago, which she had used in the bread, and he had not commented on except to eat 2 additional slices. She thought of the small tortoiseshell hair comb she had found on the windowsill of her room, which she had assumed she had simply not noticed before. He's not, she started. He absolutely is, Ruth said kindly. The question is what you're going to do about the fact that you are too. That afternoon, when Albert came in from working on the room's interior walls, Fannie was at the table mending a tear in his canvas work coat that he had left over the chair back that morning. He stopped in the doorway in his customary way and then looked at his coat in her hands and then at her face, and he said nothing at all, which she was coming to understand was his highest form of feeling. Fletcher Doone's men, she said. You've had cattle taken. He came into the kitchen and sat down. 3 head, possibly 4. I can't prove it was Doone's outfit. Ruth said the sheriff can't act without proof. Dunmore's a decent man. He needs what he needs. He looked at the table. It's not a danger to the house. They're moving cattle, not looking for confrontation. I wasn't worried about danger, she said, though she had been a little. I was worried you were carrying something alone that didn't have to be carried alone. He looked at her with a directness that she met square on because she was Fannie Vaughn and she had learned a long time ago not to look away from the things that mattered. It's a habit, he said, carrying things alone. I've been doing it a long time. So have I, she said. It doesn't mean it's the only way. He was quiet for a long moment, and she went back to the mending, and the stove settled and popped in the cold silence. And General, the cat, walked purposefully across the floor from his spot by the warmth and jumped into the empty chair between them and arranged himself with great dignity. Albert looked at the cat and then at Fannie, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically. This was not a dramatic man, but shifted the way a door shifts when a bar is removed from it, just the smallest suggestion of movement. The room should be done by Christmas, he said. Interior. The cold'll keep the finish work until spring. All right, she said. It faces east, he said. Morning light. She set down the mending and looked at him, and he looked back, and the fire in the stove breathed warm between them. Albert, she said. Fannie, he said, and the way he said her name, just that, just her name, with no sentence around it, made something in her chest do a slow, complicated turn. Neither of them said anything else, but neither of them had to. November arrived and tightened its grip on the land. The snow became constant, not the soft, occasional snow of early winter, but the working snow of the high plains that came in earnest and meant it. The temperatures dropped to things that Fannie felt with a shock of respect for the land she had come to. The kind of cold that made you understand, in your body rather than your mind, why the winters here were something people talked about in the way they talked about things that had tested them fundamentally. She and Albert found their winter rhythms as naturally as if they had rehearsed them. She managed the house and the food with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything. He managed the animals and the structural maintenance, and the wood and the 100 small exterior crises that winter invented without warning. They moved through each other's spaces without collision, which was partly because the house was well built with real room for 2 people, and partly because they had, quietly and without any formal agreement, learned each other well enough to anticipate. She knew that he needed 20 minutes of quiet after coming in from hard outdoor work before he was ready for conversation. He knew that she thought better with movement, and would sometimes pace the kitchen through a problem until she had it solved. She knew he took his coffee black except on Sunday mornings when he used a careful measure of sugar. He knew she liked to read in the hour before bed and had started leaving the lamp in the sitting room with oil enough for that. These accommodations happened without discussion. They happened the way water finds level, which is to say with no particular intention and an inevitability that could not be argued with. On the 12th of November, the Fletcher Dune situation resolved itself with a drama that was mercifully limited in its violence but significant in its disruption. Dune's men were caught by Sheriff Dunmore and a small party of volunteers on the East Ridge with 7 head of cattle that clearly carried Garrison's brand, among others. There was a tense confrontation that involved raised voices and drawn weapons, but calmer heads prevailed in the person of Dunmore himself, who was a tall, patient man of considerable moral authority, and the men were taken into custody without anyone being shot. Albert rode out when the sheriff's deputy came for him, and was gone for the better part of a day providing testimony and identifying his cattle. And Fannie spent that day with a productive anxiety that she channeled into scrubbing the kitchen floor, baking 3 different things, and having a long one-sided conversation with General about the unreliability of men who rode off into dangerous situations without adequate information about what they were riding into. He came back at dusk on a horse that wanted its stable, and Fannie heard him in the yard and went to the door, and when he came up the porch steps she saw that he was tired all the way through, the bone-deep tired of a long cold day with significant stakes. "They've got them," he said. "Dunmore's good at his work. The cattle, recovered, most of them." He came through the door and she stepped back to let him pass, and then, because she was Fannie Vaughn and she trusted her instincts more than her caution, she said, "Sit down. I'll get supper on." He sat down at his chair and she could feel him unwinding behind her as she moved around the kitchen, the way you feel the presence of a fire without looking directly at it, the warmth of someone in the room who has stopped bracing themselves. She put food on the table and sat across from him, and they ate in the comfortable silence they had built together over 6 weeks, and after a while he looked up from his plate and said, "Thank you." It was beef stew. It wasn't a significant production. "Not for the stew," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with something in his face that was simple and uncomplicated in a way she wasn't used to seeing in people's expressions, a plainness of feeling that she thought must have cost a closed-up man more than she realized. "You're welcome," she said, and then, "I was worried." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry I couldn't send word. It wasn't I understand how it works out here. I grew up frontier enough. She stopped. She had been about to say something about what she would do if something happened to him, and that sentence opened out into implications she was not ready to be honest about in words. He watched her stop and did not press her because he never pressed her, and she loved that about him. She had not intended to use that word even in her own mind. "The room's walls are done," he said after a moment that let her find solid ground again. "I'll start the floor tomorrow if the weather holds." "Show me," she said. He looked at her with surprise. Now, she said. He picked up the lamp from the table and led her through the connecting door he had cut in the east wall of the sitting room, and she stepped into the room that was hers and stood in it for the first time as something other than a shell of framing and boards. The walls were up and properly fitted, the floor joists in place though the boards were not yet laid. The ceiling was low enough to feel intimate, high enough to breathe in. There was a window frame cut in the east wall, boarded against the cold now but oriented to catch the morning light exactly as she would have placed it herself. A second window on the south wall would look out toward the mountains. "The door," she said. "There'll be a door here." "There or there," he said, indicating 2 possible places. "Whichever you prefer." She walked the room slowly, the lamp casting moving shadows, and she could feel it, the space of it, the proportions, the way it would be when it was finished. A proper room, a room built for someone who intended to stay. She stopped in the middle of it and turned to face him. "Albert," she said. "I know," he said. "You know what I'm going to say. "I think I might," he said. He held the lamp steady, his face in the warm light of it, that quiet face that she had learned over 6 weeks held more than it showed to most people. "You're going to say something about the arrangement." "I agreed to winter," she said. "That was the agreement." "Yes." "And you started building in October." "Yes." She looked at the room around them, the careful workmanship, the thought in every decision of its making. She looked at him. "Why?" she asked, not accusingly. Genuinely. As a woman asking a man who she had not yet allowed herself to fully see what was behind his eyes to let her see it. He was quiet for a long moment. Not evasive, this man was not capable of evasion. It was structurally incompatible with his nature, but thoughtful, feeling for the true word rather than the easy one. "Because," he said slowly, "on the morning of the 10th day you were here, you came out to give me coffee, and you looked at the framing, and you said your father was a carpenter who built better for other people than himself. And the way you said it told me that you had done the same thing your whole life. Built better for other people than yourself. And I thought that someone should build something for you." He paused. "So I did." Fannie Vaughn, who had not cried at her first husband's funeral because she had not loved him enough to have that to spend, who had not cried on the 4-day stagecoach to Harlan Creek through a landscape that was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she had ever seen, who had not cried on the porch when she first saw this house, and felt something she didn't have a name for. Fannie Vaughn stood in the unfinished room that a man had built for her in October, and felt the tears coming and did not stop them. Which was itself extraordinary. Albert watched her with the careful attention of a man who was very much not certain what to do with a crying woman and had the wisdom to know that doing nothing was probably the right choice. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand and looked at him. "I would like to renegotiate the arrangement," she said. His breath came out slow in the cold air of the unfinished room. "What terms are you proposing?" "Permanent," she said. "I am proposing permanent terms." He looked at her for a moment that felt very long and was probably not, and then he said, "Those are acceptable terms," in a voice that was completely steady and had something running underneath it that she could only describe as joy held very still. He crossed the room and took her free hand, the one not holding her shawl closed, and held it in both of his, and she looked up at him in the lamplight. "I'm not an easy person," she said. "I reorganize things and I have opinions and I pace when I'm thinking." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you do all of those things for 6 weeks. I've found that I am considerably in favor of all of them." She laughed, which startled them both, and then he smiled, a real smile, not the careful managed expression she had grown accustomed to, but something open and entirely unguarded. And she thought that she would like to spend the rest of her life occasionally being the reason for that smile. "The room needs a floor," she said. "I'll lay it in the morning," he said. "Good," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a formality that was so gentle it went straight through her like sunlight. And then they went back through the connecting door into the warm sitting room, where General the cat had commandeered both chairs, and looked at them with profound indifference to whatever had just occurred. December brought the deep quiet of a high plains winter, and a different quality of life inside the Garrison house, a warmth that was not entirely the stove's doing. Fannie finished the room as much as she could from the inside. She had taken over portions of the interior finish work when Albert was occupied with the animals, learning as she went, her hands finding a competence she hadn't known they had, and Albert completed the floor by mid-December. Real boards fitted tight and even, sanded smooth. She moved her things into it 2 days before Christmas. It was her room and she was glad of it, glad of the east-facing window, and the way the morning light would come through when the boards were taken off in spring, glad of the space that was hers. But she was also aware, with a private clarity, that the arrangement of the house was not the arrangement of her heart, and that by spring these would likely come to look more similar. Christmas in Harlan Creek in 1882 was a modest affair, because most things in Harlan Creek were modest, but it was warm in the way that communities in hard places are warm to each other, which is warmer than most. Ruth Heller organized a gathering at the church hall that pulled together most of the families within a reasonable riding distance, and there was food shared out, and hymns sung with varying degrees of accuracy, and a good deal of genuine fellowship. Fannie sat beside Albert in the church hall and was conscious, for the first time, of the fact that people looked at them as a unit, as a pair, not as a novelty or a curiosity but as simply Albert and Fannie, and this seemed entirely natural to everyone in the room except, intermittently, Fannie herself. Albert sat close enough that she was aware of the warmth of his arm against hers, which in a cold room is a specific kind of awareness, and when Ruth raised her glass of warm cider and said, "To new homes and new beginnings," she looked directly at Fannie, and Fannie raised her glass and decided to let herself be seen. On Christmas evening they walked home through the snow under a sky so full of stars that it seemed almost excessive, the way the territory itself was excessive in all its features, and Albert stopped on the road and looked up at it. "I used to find this lonely," he said. "The stars, the whole of it, the sky out here, the size of everything." He was quiet a moment. "It doesn't feel that way tonight." She slipped her arm through his, which she had not done before, and felt him receive this without stiffening, felt him settle slightly toward her, and they walked the rest of the way home like that, arm in arm in the snow under the enormous Wyoming sky. January was hard the way Wyoming January always was hard, which was completely and without apology. There were stretches of days where leaving the house was an exercise in endurance rather than practicality, and the animals required twice the attention at half the ease of access, and the firewood situation demanded constant management. But the house was good. Albert had built it well, and the two of them in it had developed a fluency that made the hard days manageable in a way that would have been impossible alone. On one of those deep cold January evenings, a blizzard keeping the world small and white and total outside the windows, they sat in the sitting room. They each had their own chair now, General's claim on both of them having been gently disputed over several weeks, with the lamp between them and Fannie reading and Albert making notes in the ledger he kept for the ranch's accounts. The wind pressed against the glass and the stove worked steadily, and the cat was a warm weight at Fannie's feet. She became aware that Albert had stopped writing and was watching her. She looked up from her book. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said, and then, "Everything." She waited. "I've been trying to figure out," he said, with the deliberate care of a man who has been forming a thought for some time, "how to say that what this is, the winter, all of it, is the best I've known my life to be, and I can't find better words than that." Fannie set down her book. She had known this was coming or something like it, had felt it building in the way that weather builds, a change in the air that you learn to read. "I was afraid of this arrangement when I agreed to it," she said. "Not of you. Of myself. I was afraid of what it would mean to let it matter." "Does it," he asked, "matter?" "Albert," she said, with the fullness of everything she had spent 3 months discovering, "it matters more than I have words for, and I'm not a woman who usually lacks words." He put down his ledger and came across the room and sat on the arm of her chair, which was an improvised and slightly awkward solution to the problem of wanting to be close to her. And she laughed at the logistics of it, and he looked rueful, and she took his hand and held it, and he stopped looking rueful and looked at her instead with everything open. He kissed her then, not the brief careful kiss of the ceremony, but something real and warm and long, the kind of kiss that contains a conversation, and Fannie Vaughn kissed him back with everything she'd been keeping carefully behind her practical manner and her reorganized shelves and her east-facing window. And it turned out that was quite a lot. February brought something that Albert had not expected, and Fannie had been quietly suspecting for 2 weeks. She told him on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly, over coffee, because she was Fannie Vaughn, and she did everything matter-of-factly, even when the matter at hand was not remotely ordinary. "I believe I am expecting a child," she said. He set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way he did when he was managing a strong reaction with the care it required. He looked at her. She looked back, watching his face, and what she saw move through it in sequence was surprise and then something that she could only describe as a kind of illumination, a lighting from within that transformed his expression entirely. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not entirely, but I've been keeping track and I am fairly certain." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a moment in the February morning with the snow outside and the stove warm and the house built well around them. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am completely all right," she said. And then, because he had given her honesty from the beginning and she intended to match it, "I am more than all right. I'm Albert. I hadn't expected to want this again. I told myself I didn't, but I want it very much." He was quiet, and she could see he was full to a degree that he could not express with his usual careful economy of words. He stood up from his chair and came around the table and drew her up and into his arms with a gentleness that was also entirely earnest, and she put her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, which had taken her months to learn was not the same as being diminished. "We should get a doctor's confirmation," he said into her hair. "There's no doctor in Harlan Creek. There's one in Lander. I'll take you when the weather permits. The weather won't permit for weeks. Then we'll wait," he said. "We've got time." She laughed a little against his shoulder. "We have time," she agreed. "Rather a lot of it, since the arrangement is now permanent." He held her tighter for a moment, and she felt his heartbeat under her cheek, steady and strong. March came in its slow way, the way spring comes to high country reluctantly, with false starts and setbacks, a warm day following a blizzard following a thaw following another freeze. But it came. The days lengthened. The angle of light shifted. The mountains showed themselves clearly on bright mornings, and there was a quality to the air that was different from winter's quality, a suggestion of something returning. Fannie was definitively expecting a baby, confirmed by a trip to the doctor in Lander in early March when the roads were passable again. Dr. Hames was a small, precise man who gave her practical advice with the kind of directness she appreciated, and told Albert with equal directness that his wife was in excellent health, and he should stop hovering in the doorway with that expression. Albert immediately stopped hovering with that expression and went outside to wait with a different expression that was probably the same thing more internally managed. They drove back to Harlan Creek through the early spring landscape, the world dirty and complicated in the way it always was in the period between winter and spring, the snow retreating into the shadows of things, the earth showing through in patches of brown and gray and the faintest suggestion of returning green. Fannie sat beside Albert in the wagon, her arm through his, watching the familiar country go by. It had become familiar, she realized. This land that had seemed enormous and indifferent when she'd arrived on the stagecoach in September was now hers in the way that places become yours. Not because you own them, but because you've lived through a winter in them. "I'd like to write to my sister," she said. "Of course," he said. "I should have before this. Eleanor's in St. Louis. She doesn't know anything about. She thought I was making a terrible decision. Coming here, the arrangement, the marriage of convenience." She paused. "She wasn't wrong to worry. Arrangements of that kind don't usually turn out like this," he said. "No," she said. "They generally don't." "I knew by the second day," Albert said. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, his hands easy on the reins. "That's not possible. You didn't know me at all." "I didn't know you," he said. "But I knew that you looked at my bookshelves before you looked at anything else in the house, and you looked at the framing of the rooms before you looked at the furniture, and you were considering whether to trust me instead of whether to charm me, and those are not common qualities in anyone." Fannie was quiet, looking at his profile against the spring sky. "I was not looking to fall in love," she said. "I want you to know that. I was not in Cheyenne with a plan to be swept up in something. I was just trying to not be alone for a winter without being dependent on anyone's charity." "I know," he said. "Neither was I. I was looking for a practical arrangement that would get me through until spring. And then you built a room in October." He looked at her then, with that open expression she had first seen in the unfinished room by lamplight in November. "And then I built a room in October," he confirmed. "I couldn't tell you exactly when the practical arrangement stopped being the point. I just know it stopped." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and he adjusted the reins to one hand and put his free arm around her, and they drove through the March landscape like that, and it felt entirely natural, which was the most extraordinary thing of all. Spring came properly in April, the way it always eventually did, and with it came the real work of the ranch coming back to life. Albert's 3 ranch hands returned from their winter work in the South. A quiet man named Samuel, a younger hand named Cody, who couldn't have been more than 20, and had the cheerful resilience of someone who had not yet accumulated enough experience to be properly discouraged by anything, and an older hand named Dell who had been with Albert for 4 years, and looked at Fannie with a measuring eye on his first day back, and then nodded once, as if she had passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. "Dell approves of you," Albert told her that evening. "How can you tell? He hasn't said 10 words to me." Dell doesn't say words when a nod will do. The nod was considerable. She planted her medicinal garden in early May, south of the kitchen window, just as Albert had suggested that October morning when she needed to say something safe. Lavender for pain and sleep, peppermint for stomach ailments, yarrow for cuts and fever, calendula for skin conditions, chamomile for a dozen things. Ruth Heller came out to help her, and they spent a warm May afternoon on their knees in the dirt being cheerfully domestic, which Fannie would have rejected as a self-description 6 months ago, but now found she was not embarrassed by. "You look different," Ruth said with her customary directness. "I'm expecting," Fannie said. It was the first time she'd told anyone outside of Lander. Ruth sat back on her heels and looked at her with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that Fannie felt the warmth of it right through the chest. "Oh, Fannie," she said, "that is the best news I have heard in a long while." "It's due in October," Fannie said, "which means a winter baby." "The best kind," Ruth said firmly. "Born in a warm house into winter, they come out tough." "October," Fannie repeated, thinking about it. "A year since I arrived, almost exactly." Ruth looked at her with a soft expression that contained, underneath the softness, something very sharp about understanding the nature of unexpected things. "You know what I think about that arrangement you came here with? I imagine you're going to tell me. I think sometimes we tell ourselves a story that keeps us small enough to survive the risk," Ruth said, going back to her planting. "And then someone comes along and builds you a room, and you realize the story was never the whole truth of you." Fannie looked at the kitchen window above them, the house solid and good behind it, and thought of Albert inside, working on the books with the same careful attention he brought to all his accounts, and thought of the room that faced east, and the winter they had spent inside the walls he had built, and the child that was coming and the spring that was here. "No," she said, "it was never the whole truth." The summer of 1883 was generous by Wyoming standards. Enough rain, not too much, the grass coming in good and the cattle fattening well, and the sky doing its enormous summer business of clouds and sun, and the occasional thunderstorm that came rolling in from the mountains like theater. Fannie worked through the summer with adjustments made as her shape changed, the medicinal garden producing well, the household running with the efficiency she had established, and the warmth that had grown inside it. She and Albert had their first proper argument in July. It was about the roof of the new room, specifically about whether Albert needed to go up on the roof in the heat to reseal a section of the pitch that she had noticed was showing signs of potential future trouble, and whether he needed to do this immediately or could wait until the cooler morning hours or possibly a different day entirely. Albert's position was that the thing he'd identified needed doing, and he was going to do it. Fannie's position was that the heat was unreasonable, and he should use better judgment about the risks. They went back and forth on this with increasing directness for a period that General the cat observed from a safe distance with what appeared to be amusement, And then Fannie said something with more sharpness than she intended about men and their obstinate relationship with their own health. And Albert said something about not needing to be managed like a wayward calf, and they both stopped. There was a moment. "I'm sorry," Fannie said. "And I am," Albert said. The calf remark was accurate, she said. "I was going to say unfair," he said. "You worry because he paused, looking for the right word, because you have a stake in what happens to me." "I have an enormous stake in what happens to you," she said. "I have our entire life as a stake in what happens to you. So yes, when you propose climbing on a roof in July heat, I become obstinate about it," he said with the hint of a smile. "Is that what you think I am?" "I think you are the most competent and practical and fiercely loving person I have ever known," he said. "And I think those things in combination can occasionally look like obstinance when really it's just Fannie." She looked at him for a moment, this man in his work shirt in the July kitchen, and then she crossed the room and took his face in both hands and kissed him, which was a different kind of resolution than the ones she had practiced before in her life, and she found she preferred it. He did not go on the roof until after sundown when the heat had broken, and she brought him water while he worked, and the roof got sealed and nobody fell off anything. And they had supper later than usual that night in the companionable quiet of people who have fought and come back to each other, and found the coming back easier than they expected. August passed in its long, golden way, and September arrived again, and Fannie stood on the porch on the first morning of it and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach exactly a year ago with a trunk and a letter and a determination not to need anything from anyone more than she'd contracted for. She put her hand on her belly, which was substantial now, and felt the baby shift in that particular way that always made her catch her breath. "That one has opinions," she said to Albert, who had come up behind her with coffee. "Takes after you," he said. She leaned back against him and he put his arms around her and they stood on the porch looking out at the September morning, the mountains clear and the light new and the land running away from them in all directions toward the horizon, and the house behind them solid and built with care and full of the life they had made inside it. "A year ago tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "I remember everything about that day. You didn't show it." "I showed as much as I had to show," he said. "Which in September was not much. I hadn't learned yet that you'd stay." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "I hadn't decided yet." "I know," he said. "That's why I started building in October." She pressed her forehead against his chest and felt him hold her, the solid arms of a man who built things to last. And she thought that the story she had told herself, practical arrangement, winter only, no entanglements, had been the smallest, least truthful version of what she was capable of, and she was grateful beyond words that he had known that before she did. The baby came on a night in early October that had turned sharply cold, as if the territory was marking the occasion with appropriate ceremony. Ruth Heller was there, having established firmly in August that she would be there and no argument would be entertained on this point. And Dr. Hames had made the trip from Lander at Albert's request a week before, setting himself up at the Heller house to be available. Albert spent the labor in the next room in a state of focused, quiet uselessness that Ruth had informed him was entirely standard and would not be improved by hovering. He sat in his chair in the sitting room and looked at the connecting door to Fannie's room and listened to the sounds coming from it with an expression that Dell, who had stayed late on some invented pretext, later described to Cody and Samuel as the most purely agonized thing he had ever seen on a man who was not, in fact, the one in pain. At 2 in the morning, the cry of a new person entered the world. Ruth came to the sitting room door and looked at Albert and said simply, "Come." He crossed the room in 3 steps and went through the door into the room he had built in October of the previous year, the room with the east-facing window that would show the baby its first sunrises. And Fannie was propped against the pillows with her hair dark with sweat and her face transformed by exhaustion, and something so bright it was difficult to look at directly. And she was holding a small, red, indignant creature against her chest. "Albert," she said, and her voice was different, lower, stripped of all its management and practicality, just Fannie at the absolute bottom of herself. "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she turned the baby toward him, and he looked at this new person, this small, fierce creature with Fannie's stubborn jaw already visible in miniature, and felt something happen in his chest that had no name in any language he'd learned. He put out one large, careful finger, and the baby wrapped an unfocused but determined fist around it. "He's got your grip," Fannie said. "He's got your expression," Albert said, already convinced he knows better than everyone else in the room. Fannie laughed weakly and leaned her head back. "What shall we name him?" They had talked about names through the summer without settling anything, in the way that people sometimes need the reality of the person to find the right name for them. "James," Albert said. "After your father." Fannie looked at him. She had told him, one winter evening in January, about her father, the carpenter who had built beautiful things for everyone but himself, told it the way she told most true things, plainly, without making herself small inside the truth of it. She had not expected him to carry it this long. "James Garrison," she said, feeling the weight of it. "Yes, and then Albert." "Yes," he said, "I'm glad I came early." He looked at her, this woman who had ridden in on September 30th because she refused to wait for anything, who had stood in his kitchen and shaken his hand and reorganized his shelves, and paced through his sitting room thinking, and gone still in a room he built for her by lamplight in November, and negotiated for permanent terms with the same directness she brought to everything. "So am I," he said. "I'm glad every single day." He kissed her forehead and she closed her eyes, and the baby in her arms made the small sounds of a new person orienting to the world. And in the room with the east-facing window, the night was still and cold and perfect. The following year moved forward the way years do when they are full of living, quickly, and with the accumulating texture of things actually happening. James Garrison grew from the red, indignant newborn into a boy who sat up with great determination in February and crawled with alarming efficiency by spring, pulling himself toward whatever captured his attention with the tenacious purposefulness that was, Albert said, entirely inherited from his mother, which Fannie denied and everyone else confirmed. The house accommodated a child with the same ease with which it had accommodated Fannie, because it had been built with room for more than one person and filled out now into its full possibility. The room that had been the storeroom and then Fannie's own room became the nursery when James arrived and needed the east-facing light, and Fannie moved into the bedroom with Albert as if this had always been the plan, which in a way it had been, though neither of them had said so in those terms until it simply was. General the cat accepted James with a regal tolerance that nobody had been entirely sure of, and was observed on several occasions allowing the baby to grab his fur with more patience than most humans managed, which Dell said was more testimony to the cat's character than anything else he'd seen on the ranch. In the spring, Fannie wrote to her sister Alina in St. Louis. A long letter, the kind she had been composing in her head through the winter, and finally committed to paper on a warm April afternoon with James asleep in the next room and Albert visible through the kitchen window working in the yard. "Dear Alina," she wrote, "you were right to worry about me, but wrong about what I needed worrying for. I did not get into trouble in Wyoming. I got into something considerably better than that, and I am writing to tell you about it because you deserve to know that your obstinate practical sister has been thoroughly undone by a man who builds rooms in October and calls his cat General and kisses her forehead with a gentleness she did not know she was allowed to want." Alina wrote back 3 weeks later with several exclamation points and a promise to visit in the summer. She came in July, Fannie Vaughn, who was 26 and sharp-featured, and immediately took the measure of Albert Garrison with the thoroughness of a protective older sister despite being the younger one. She watched him for 2 full days before she said anything to Fannie about it. On the 3rd morning she found Fannie in the kitchen garden. "He looks at you," Alina said without preamble. "Most people look at each other," Fannie said, deadheading the calendula. "Not like that," Alina said. "Not like you're the fixed point he's navigating by." Fanny looked up from her work. "He built you a room," Eleanor said. "You told me, but I didn't understand it until I saw the house." "Fanny, there are men who buy you flowers when they've done something wrong. There are men who tell you what you want to hear. And then there are men who build you a room in October." She paused. "I'm glad you came early to look the situation over. I'm glad you had that much sense." "I had enough sense to recognize what I was looking at," Fanny said. "It just took me longer than it should have." "Most true things take longer than they should," Eleanor said. "That's what makes them true." Eleanor stayed for 3 weeks and left with the promise to return for Christmas, and the information, delivered to Fanny privately on her last evening, that she thought Harlan Creek was a ridiculous name for a town, and that the house was the nicest she had seen in the territory, and that she was not surprised in the least that Fanny had made it home. The summer of 1884 was marked by 2 things of significance. The first was that Harlan Creek grew. 2 new families arrived in the spring and put down roots, and a proper general store opened in what had been an empty lot, and there was serious talk of a schoolhouse that became, by summer's end, the beginnings of an actual schoolhouse, which Fanny involved herself in immediately with the organizational energy of a woman who understood that community was built by the people willing to build it. The second was that Albert began, in August, to build an addition on the north side of the house. Fanny noticed the measuring cord on a Tuesday morning, and came out to find him on the north side of the house, with the familiar expression of a man calculating seriously. "You're building again," she said. "The house is a little close for company," he said. "I thought another room." She looked at him with the fully open expression of a woman who loved a man completely and knew him through and through. "Albert Garrison," she said. "Are you expecting something I should know about?" He looked at her steadily. "Are you?" There was a moment where the August morning held them both. "I thought it might be too soon to say," she said. "James is not yet a year." "It's not too soon," he said, with the quiet certainty he had for things he was sure about. She closed the distance between them and took his hand, and he held it in both of his, and the land around them was green and alive, and the mountains stood in the north doing their permanent, patient business of being enormous, and the house behind them had a room for Fanny and a room for James, and now the beginning of a room for whoever was coming. "Another October," she said. "I'll have the frame up by first frost," he said. She laughed, and he laughed with her, and General, who had followed them out at some point, sat on the porch in the August heat and looked at them with the measured dignity of a creature who had known how this was going to go from the very beginning. The schoolhouse was completed in September 1884, and Ruth Heller organized a school session beginning in October with 12 children from the surrounding area, including, eventually, James Garrison in a few years' time. The town had a teacher brought in from Cheyenne, a young woman named Harriet Morse, who arrived with exactly the same combination of practicality and private uncertainty that Fanny recognized from her own arrival 2 years prior, and Fanny made it her business to be there when the stagecoach came in and to say, with all the specific warmth of someone who knew what it was to arrive new and uncertain in an enormous landscape, "Come, I'll show you where things are." The second baby, a girl they named Clara after Albert's mother, was born in February 1885, when the snow was deep and the house was warm, and James, now 15 months old and of the firm opinion that everything in the house was for his benefit, observed her arrival with the benign suspicion of a firstborn encountering competition for the first time. Albert held Clara with the ease of a man who had done this before, and the wonder of a man who understood it was not a thing you got used to, and looked at Fanny across the room with the full open expression that she had first seen in a half-built room in November of 1882, and had been collecting ever since, every version of it, like finding gold in a river, unexpected, genuine, more valuable than you'd planned for. "That's two," Fanny said, leaning back against her pillows. "That's two," he agreed. "The north room is finished just in time." "I planned it that way," he said with great dignity. "You did not plan the timing of this." "I planned the room," he said. "The timing sorted itself." She laughed, and he came and sat beside her, and they held their daughter between them in the February night, the wind pressing at the windows that were good windows in a house that was good and solid, and had been built a piece at a time by a man who built for the long term and had built better than he knew. Harlan Creek in 1885 was a different town from the one Fannie had ridden into in September 1882. There was a school, a proper general store with more than was strictly needed for basic survival, a second church for the denomination that didn't care for Reverend Pratt's sermons, a small hotel above the bank for travelers, and a population that had nearly doubled. The railroad was being talked about for the next few years, which everyone agreed would change things in ways both promising and uncertain. Albert's ranch had done well through 2 good years and one very hard one. He had added to his cattle, rebuilt the corral to a better design with Samuel's input, and put in a proper root cellar that Fannie had been asking about since the first winter, and that made the food storage situation considerably better. The 3 hands stayed on year-round now, which changed the character of the work, and Cody, who was 22 and had grown considerably in confidence and competence, was talking about taking up a claim of his own land east of town. On an evening in October of 1885, the 3rd October Fannie had spent in Harlan Creek, and the month that felt, for obvious reasons, like the hinge of her whole life. Albert came in from the evening chores and sat down at the kitchen table while she was finishing with supper, and James toddled between their legs with the single-minded momentum of a very small person with somewhere very important to be. And Clara made satisfied sounds from the cradle in the corner that Albert had built in the weeks before she arrived. Fannie put supper on the table and sat down, and Albert said grace in the plain way he did, brief and direct, and they ate with the ordinary sounds of a family eating together, James narrating whatever was occurring in his mind in the fragmentary speech of a toddler, Clara occasionally offering opinions from the cradle, the fire settling, the wind doing its October work outside. When James had been put to bed with the considerable negotiation that this required, and Clara had gone down in her cradle without trouble, and the kitchen was quiet and clean, they sat in the sitting room in their chairs with the lamp between them, and Albert was looking at her in that way he had, not studying, not examining, just seeing, the way you look at something you love because looking at it is itself a satisfaction. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I was thinking about October," he said. "Which part of it?" "3 years ago," he said. "October 3rd I started building." She looked at him. The lamplight was the same kind of light it had always been in this room, warm and limited, the rest of the world held at the window. "You were building before you knew me," she said. "I was building because I'd started knowing you," he said. "Fannie, 6 days of knowing you was enough." She set down her mending and gave him her full attention, which he had always deserved and she had always given when it mattered. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You can ask me anything," she said. "I want to ask you if you're happy here." He said it simply, this man who did not say unnecessary things. "Not if you're managing or if it's working, if you're happy." She looked at the room around them, the books on the shelf, her books alongside his now. The collection expanded and mingled until it was impossible to say which belonged to whom. The chairs that were theirs, the cradle in the corner, the sound of James asleep in the room that had been hers first, the house around them solid and warm and built well. She looked at the man across from her, this Albert Garrison who had written her a letter with no poetry in it, and built a room in October with everything in it that poetry was supposed to convey, who had met her on the main street of the smallest town she'd ever seen, and stood there with his hat in his hands and let her look, who had given her a room of her own and a kitchen she'd reorganized, and a garden facing south, and a life she had not planned for and could not now imagine the absence of. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said, "in my life. I don't say that easily or lightly or to make you feel good. I say it because it's the truest thing I know how to say." He crossed the room and sat on the arm of her chair, which was still slightly awkward logistics, and she still laughed at it, and he looked rueful, and she took his hand, and none of it had changed, and all of it had changed. "Good," he said. "That's what I'm building toward." "You're still building." "Always," he said. "There's always something that wants building." She held his hand in both of hers and leaned her head against his arm and listened to the house around them. The wind, the fire, the sleeping children, the cat moving somewhere in the quiet rooms, the whole warm inhabited world they had built together from a letter and a stagecoach and a practical arrangement that had never, not even for a moment, been only practical. Outside, the October night was cold and enormous and full of stars. The same sky that had seemed lonely and excessive to a younger version of Albert Garrison. The same sky that had looked like a bad omen to a younger version of Fannie Vaughn on the morning she rode into a town too small for its own name. They sat together in the lamplight of the room he had built and listened to their life, and it was enough, more than enough. It was the whole of everything, and the stars outside went on with their enormous business, indifferent and beautiful, the way the territory was always both of those things at once. Spring would come again, as it always did, and summer, and another October, and another room that might want building, because that was the nature of a life that kept expanding into the space you made for it. But tonight the house was warm and the children were sleeping, and the man across from her was the truest thing she had ever found by accident. And Fannie Vaughn, who had ridden into Harlan Creek with a practical arrangement and a determination not to need anything more than she'd contracted for, put her head against Albert Garrison's shoulder and let herself be entirely, unguardedly, completely home. General the cat, who had known all along, arranged himself at their feet and purred.